She had 48 hours to pay a dead man's debt, or lose the only family she had left. When Clara Whitmore watched armed men drag her 12-year-old sister through the snow, she learned something that no frontier woman should ever have to learn: that in Montana, 1883, justice was not blind. It was bought. And the man who owned it had just taken Emma as collateral. Every door slammed in her face. Every lawman looked the other way. So she did the only thing left to do. She rode toward the mountain where the monster lived. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay until the end. This one's going to hurt before it gets better. The morning her father died, Clara Whitmore was elbow deep in flour. She had been trying to make biscuits, a stupid, ordinary thing to be doing, when she heard the sound from the back bedroom. Not a cry, not a gasp, just a long, slow exhale that seemed to go on longer than any breath had a right to, and then the silence that followed it sat in the cabin like something with weight. She stood there for a moment with her hands covered in dough, flour dusting her forearms up to the elbow, and she listened to that silence, and she knew. She walked to the doorway. Robert Whitmore lay on his side in the bed that had once been shared with Clara's mother, before the fever took her 3 winters back. His eyes were half open, the way a man's eyes go when sleep catches him mid-thought. His chest did not move. The candle on the nightstand had burned down to a stub of wax, and the room smelled of tallow and sickness and something else underneath that Clara had no name for. The particular smell of a body that has decided it is finished. She did not cry right away. She went back to the kitchen, wiped her hands on her apron, and stood at the window looking out at the gray Montana morning. November had come in hard that year. The ground was frozen in ridges where the wagon wheels had cut through mud in October, and then everything locked solid before it could smooth out. Snow had been falling on and off for 2 weeks. The homestead, if you were generous enough to call it that, sat in a shallow draw below a tree line of ponderosa pines, 160 acres of rocky, ungrateful soil that Robert Whitmore had spent 15 years trying to bend to his will. The soil had won. Clara was 23 years old. She had her mother's cheekbones and her father's stubbornness, and exactly $11.40 to her name. Emma came out of the small room she shared with Clara, rubbing her eyes. She was 12, gangly, with dark hair that never stayed where it was pinned. She looked at Clara's face and stopped rubbing her eyes. "Is it Papa?" Emma said. Clara nodded. Emma walked to the back bedroom and stood in the doorway for a long moment. She was quiet in the way children are sometimes quiet when the grief is too large to make noise about. Then she came back and pressed her face against Clara's side, and Clara put her arm around her sister's shoulders, and they stood there at the window together while the snow came down outside. That was the beginning of it. The burial was the next day, because in that country in November you did not wait. The ground was hard, and it took Clara 3 hours with a pickaxe to open it enough. And then she wrapped her father in the quilt from the bed, the one his mother had made, that had traveled from Ohio in a covered wagon before Clara was born, and she and Emma and the Hendersons from the neighboring property, who were the closest thing to friends the Whitmores had, lowered him in. Emma threw a handful of frozen dirt. Then it was done. Nora Henderson, who was a stout woman with a practical face and a kind heart that she expressed mostly through food, pressed a wrapped parcel of salt pork into Clara's hands before she and her husband climbed back into their buckboard. She did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. The Hendersons had their own struggles and their own thin winters, and pity did not fill a root cellar. Clara watched them go, then walked back to the cabin. Ock, she found the papers 3 days later. She had been going through her father's things, the small, accumulating wreckage of a man who had spent his whole life meaning to get organized, when she found the cigar box under the floorboard beneath the bed. She'd known about the box, vaguely. Her father had called it his important papers box, with a certain pride that she now understood was the pride of a man who wanted to seem like someone with important papers. Most of what was inside was not important. A daguerreotype of her mother at 20, so young it hardly looked like her. 2 letters from Ohio that nobody had answered in years, a deed to the property, which she already knew about, and the promissory note. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and read it twice. Then she set it down on her knee and looked at the wall for a while. The note was dated 14 months ago. Her father had borrowed $320 from a man named Silas Crow, against the deed of the property. The interest terms were written in small, careful handwriting that suggested the man who wrote them had done this many times before and knew exactly what he was doing. The note was due November 30th. It was currently November 19th. $320. Clara tried to think of a way to get $320 in 11 days and could not think of one because there was no way. The homestead itself, if you could sell it in 11 days, which you could not, might fetch $200 on a good day from a generous buyer. The livestock, 2 horses, 4 chickens, a pig that had been sick since September and had not improved, was worth maybe $40. She picked up the note again and read the name of the creditor, Silas Crow. She had heard the name before, the way you heard weather, as something that came from somewhere beyond your direct experience, but whose effects were well understood. Crow owned the general store in Harlan's Crossing, which was the nearest town, 12 miles east. He also owned the hotel, the lumber operation out past the river. And in the way that men like Crow owned things without their names appearing on any document, the sheriff. His name came up in conversation the way a bruise comes up, slowly, and then all at once. She rode into Harlan's Crossing the next morning. It was cold enough that the horse's breath made white clouds with every step, and the main street of the town was half deserted, which it usually was in the deep morning when sensible people were inside by their stoves. Clara tied her horse at the rail outside Crow's general store and went in. The store smelled of leather and tobacco and pickles from the barrel by the door. A young man behind the counter looked up when she came in. He had the face of someone who worked for Silas Crow and had learned to be carefully neutral about everything. "I need to speak with Mr. Crow," Clara said. "Mr. Crow doesn't do business at the store," the young man said. "You'd need to write to his office." "His office?" "On Millard Street, near the hotel." Clara looked at him. He looked back at her with his carefully neutral face. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said. "Robert Whitmore's daughter. My father passed last week. I need to speak with Mr. Crow about a promissory note." Something shifted slightly in the young man's neutral expression. Not pity. More like the recognition of an unpleasant event that he had been expecting. "I'll let him know you're in town," he said. She waited on the boardwalk outside for 20 minutes in the cold, stamping her feet and watching the street. A man rode past without looking at her. A woman came out of the millinery 3 doors down, glanced at Clara, and went back inside. Then a voice came from behind her. "Miss Whitmore?" She turned. Silas Crow was not what she had expected, which meant she had been expecting something more obviously monstrous. He was perhaps 55, compact and well-dressed in a dark wool coat with a fur collar, clean-shaven, with gray hair combed back from a wide forehead. His face was not cruel-looking, it was simply resolved. Like a man who had decided a long time ago what the world was, and had found that he was correct, and had stopped being bothered about it. "Mr. Crow," Clara said, "I'd like to talk about my father's debt." "Of course," he said. He said it easily, pleasantly, as if debt were a perfectly natural topic for a cold morning in November, which, for him, it was. "I was sorry to hear about your father. He was a decent man." "He was," Clara said. "He was also in debt to you to the sum of $320, with 11 days remaining on the note. I'd like to discuss an extension." Crow tilted his head slightly. He had small, dark eyes that looked at her with a kind of professional attention, the way a surveyor looks at land he is preparing to acquire. "An extension on what terms?" "Time," Clara said. "Spring. By spring I could sell stock, possibly take on a crop loan through the—" "Miss Whitmore," Crow said gently. "The terms of the note are quite clear. I drew them that way deliberately. Your father understood them." "My father is dead, which makes the note due to his estate. And as I understand it, you and your sister are his estate." He let that sit for a moment. "I am sorry for your circumstances, genuinely, but I have a business to run." Clara looked at him steadily. "What would it take?" she said. "To give me time?" He considered this with an expression of mild thoughtfulness, like a man mulling over a menu. "There is a possibility," he said, "the mineral rights on the western 40 acres of your property. If you were to sign those over—" "No." The word came out before she had finished thinking it. She knew about the western 40. Her father had always believed there was silver there. He had never had the money to prove it, but he believed it, and it was the one piece of the homestead that he had clung to through every bad year. She was not going to sign it over to Silas Crow for an extension that would probably come with more impossible terms attached. Crow looked at her for a moment. "Then I'm afraid we have a problem," he said. He was polite about it. That was the worst part. He was absolutely polite, even as he turned and walked back toward the hotel, and even as Clara stood on the boardwalk watching him go, understanding that the conversation was over and that she had accomplished nothing. She tried everything she could think of in the days that followed. She went to the bank. The banker, whose name was Felton, was a thin man with spectacles who looked at her land deed and the promissory note and then looked at her over the top of his spectacles and told her that he was not in a position to offer credit against a property with a senior lien already attached. He said it kindly, which made it no more useful. She went to Henderson. He spread his hands across his kitchen table and looked at her with genuine sorrow, which she believed was genuine, and told her that he was 3 seasons behind on his own mortgage and had borrowed against his equipment, and if he had $300, he would not be eating salt pork twice a day in November. His wife pressed more food into Clara's hands when she left. She went to the sheriff's office. The sheriff was a man named Aldous Pryor, heavy-set, with a graying mustache, and the look of a man who had been comfortable for too long to be useful in situations requiring discomfort. He listened to Clara's account of the promissory note and Crow's terms with his hands folded on his desk. "The note sounds legal to me," he said. "The note might be legal," Clara said. "But if there's a way to challenge the interest terms, if there's a circuit court judge, I could petition for time." "Judge Carmody comes through in March," Pryor said. "Or May, depending. The note is due November 30th. "Well," Pryor said, and did not finish the sentence. She sat there in the chair across from his desk and looked at him, and understood, fully and completely, what she was dealing with. This was not a man who had been defeated. This was a man who had been compensated. There was a difference. She left. She sat on her horse in the street outside the sheriff's office and looked at the gray sky and tried to think of what to do. The temperature had been dropping all week. Another storm was coming in from the north. She could feel it in the particular quality of the cold, the way the air went still and dense before the sky opened up. 9 days until November 30th. Yeah. She was at the dry goods counter in the general store 4 days later, trying to make $11 stretch across what she needed for the winter, when she overheard 2 men talking near the stove. She was not trying to listen, but the name caught her like a hook. "Say he's been up there since before the war." "I don't believe half what they say. I believe enough of it. Tolliver's boys went up after him 3 years back. 2 of them came back. One of them didn't talk much about it afterward." "What's he do up there?" "Nobody knows. Traps, hunts, doesn't come down, doesn't want anything from anyone." A pause, and then, "They say Crow's been trying to run him off that valley for 2 years. Can't do it." The other man made a skeptical sound. "Nobody can't be run off if Crow wants him off." "Blackthorn can." The name dropped into the warm air of the store like a stone into still water. Clara turned slowly to look at the 2 men by the stove. They were both older, both weathered, both the kind of men who drank their coffee in the morning without sitting down. She recognized one of them, a cattle hand who'd worked a neighboring spread for years. "Excuse me," she said. Both men looked at her. "Gideon Blackthorn," she said. "What can you tell me about him?" The cattle hand looked at his companion, then back at Clara. His expression was not unkind. It was the expression of a man delivering information that he expects to be ignored. "Nothing good," he said. "He's a killer, miss. Not the kind that needs a reason." "Where is he?" A long pause. "Up in the Bitterroots, north face, above Crow Creek. There's a valley up there, Box Canyon, really, that he's claimed. But, miss, nobody goes up there. Not in November, anyway." "Thank you," Clara said. She paid for her flour and her salt and her coffee and walked out into the cold. She went home and sat with Emma that evening by the fire and made a meal out of cornmeal and what was left of Nora Henderson's salt pork. And they ate without talking much, which was fine because neither of them had anything useful to say. Emma was not a child who fell apart. Clara had noticed this about her sister over the past 2 weeks, had noticed it with a complicated mixture of relief and grief. Relief because she couldn't have handled falling apart herself and also managing someone else falling apart. Grief because Emma was 12 years old, and 12-year-olds should be allowed to fall apart when their father dies. Instead, Emma did the chores. She fed the chickens and checked on the pig and hauled water and stacked wood, and in the evening she sat close to Clara by the fire and sometimes put her head on Clara's shoulder without saying anything. Clara was putting her to bed when Emma looked up at her. "Are we going to lose the farm?" Emma said. Clara thought about lying. She was good at lying when it was necessary, which she didn't consider a character flaw so much as a practical skill. But Emma had her mother's eyes, and there was something about those eyes that made lying feel like work. "I don't know yet," Clara said. "I'm working on it." Emma looked at her for a moment. "Is it very bad?" "Yes," Clara said, "but I'm still working on it." Emma nodded and turned over toward the wall, and Clara pulled the quilts up around her shoulders and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment in the dark, listening to her breathe. Then she got up and went back to the fire and sat there alone, thinking about Gideon Blackthorne. She had almost convinced herself not to do it. It was, by every reasonable measure, a terrible idea. Riding into the Bitterroot Mountains in late November alone, looking for a man who was either a dangerous recluse or an outright killer, depending on who you asked, on the strength of two old men's conversation by a store stove. This was not a plan. It was desperation wearing a plan's clothing. But she had $11.40 and 9 days left on the note, and she had tried everything else. She was still sitting there, trying to talk herself into being sensible, when she heard the horses. She heard them before she saw them. Multiple horses, moving at a deliberate pace up the frozen ruts of the track that led to the homestead. Not a social visit. Nobody made a social visit at 10 o'clock on a November night. She was on her feet and at the door before the knock came. She opened it. Silas Crow stood on her porch with two men behind him. Not the same two armed men she'd have expected. Not rough hired hands. These were dressed better, which somehow made them more frightening. One of them held a lantern. The other one was watching the tree line like he was paid to watch tree lines. "Miss Whitmore," Crow said, "I apologize for the late hour. May we come in?" "No," Claire said. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not anger, exactly. Recalibration. "Very well. I'll be direct then. I've come to discuss the matter of your father's note. Given the circumstances, your bereavement, your limited resources, I've decided to make a more generous offer than what we discussed in town." Clara waited. "I'll forgive the note entirely," he said. "The debt is canceled. In exchange, you deed me the western 40 acres. The rest of the property remains yours." It was a better offer than before. Clara knew it was a better offer than before. She also knew that Silas Crow did not make generous offers without calculating exactly what they would return to him. The Western 40 was worth more than $320 to him, or he would not be standing on her porch at 10 o'clock at night offering to forgive a debt for it. "I need time to think about it," she said. "I understand," Crow said. He smiled. It was a pleasant smile. "But I should be clear. This offer is time limited. If you haven't accepted by November 26th, I'll be proceeding to collect on the note as written." He paused. "I trust you understand the full implications." "I understand the implications," Clara said. He tipped his hat and turned, and his men followed him back toward the horses. Clara closed the door and stood behind it with her hand flat against the wood and listened to the sound of the horses until it faded into the dark and the wind. Then she went and looked in on Emma, who was asleep, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her face young and unguarded in sleep the way it never quite was when she was awake. November 26th was 5 days away. She left the next morning before dawn. She wrote a note for Emma and left it on the table where she would find it, and she left enough food and firewood for a week, and she saddled the gray horse, not the better one, because she needed to leave the better one in case Emma needed to get to the Hendersons, and she rode north. The Bitterroots rose ahead of her as the sky lightened, black-tipped and white-shouldered, the snow line beginning about halfway up and running continuous from there to the peaks. They were the kind of mountains that made you feel the smallness of things, not in a way that was peaceful, in a way that was simply true. She had a bedroll and 3 days' worth of food, and her father's old Sharps rifle and a cartridge belt, and the name Crow Creek, which was apparently somewhere up there in the North Face. She also had, although she would not have named it this way, nothing left to lose. The gray horse moved steadily north as the sun came up red and low behind the eastern ridge, throwing long blue shadows across the snow crust. Clara settled into the saddle and kept her eyes on the mountains and did not let herself think too far ahead, because thinking too far ahead in situations like this was the same as despair with better posture. 1 hour at a time, 1 mile at a time. The mountains did not look any closer after 2 hours of riding, which was the particular cruelty of Western geography. Distance was unreliable there, played tricks, made 3 hours feel like progress, and then suddenly you were still nowhere. By noon she had reached the lower foothills, where the trail, such as it was, narrowed and steepened and the snow deepened from a dusting to something serious. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since morning. She could feel it at the edges of her face, the tips of her fingers inside her gloves. She stopped and ate some hardtack and let the horse rest and drink from a creek that was half frozen, the center current still running dark and quick between the ice shelves on either bank. The horse drank and then looked at her with the patient, slightly reproachful expression of a horse that has been asked to do something it finds pointless but will do anyway. "I know," Clara said. She got back in the saddle and kept riding. Bob. The storm caught her late in the afternoon, just as she was beginning to believe she had made it too far in to turn back, which was probably when she'd believed it all along, if she was being honest. It came in from the northwest, the way the serious ones always came, and it did not announce itself with gentle preliminary flurries. It simply arrived, fully formed, a wall of white that reduced visibility to 15 feet and dropped the temperature another 15 degrees inside of an hour. Clara had been following what might have been a trail or might have been a dry stream bed. It was hard to tell in this country where the land made no promises, and now she couldn't see well enough to follow anything. The gray horse had slowed to a careful, step-by-step progress, and she could feel him working against the wind with each stride. She was trying to find a windbreak, anything, a rock face, a dense stand of timber, when the horse stopped. She did not hear the wolf before she saw it. It was simply there, 10 feet ahead in the white, standing in the trail, large, gray-brown, ears forward. Then 2 more materialized out of the storm on the left flank, and she understood this was not an accidental meeting. The gray horse made a sound that was not quite a scream, something lower than that, more fundamental. And Clara had one hand on the rifle when the horse reared, not all the way up, but enough, and then lunged hard to the right, and her foot came out of the stirrup, and then the snow was coming up at her from the wrong direction. She hit hard. The rifle went one way, the horse went another. She heard him crashing through brush, and then the sound fading, and then just the wind. She was on her back in the snow with the breath knocked out of her and the wolves still there, or at least one of them was. She could see it through the white, closer now, 6 feet maybe, watching her with the steady yellow-eyed patience of something that had time. She could not breathe. Her hand was scrabbling in the snow where the rifle had landed, but her hand could not find it, and her lungs were locked, and the wolf took one step closer. Then a sound split the storm. Not a gunshot. Louder than a gunshot. Sharper. More like the crack of a very large stick of wood when cold gets into it. Then a voice, deep and completely without panic, shouted a single word that she could not make out over the wind. The wolf's eyes moved off her, and then it turned and walked into the white, and the storm swallowed it, and there was a moment of pure silence underneath the wind. Then a shape came out of the darkness ahead of her. Clara got her breath back in a ragged gasp and pushed herself up on one arm, and she looked up at a man who stood over her in the snow, tall, wide-shouldered, dressed in furs and heavy wool, with a face she could not quite make out in the stormlight, and a rifle that he'd already lowered to his side because apparently he didn't need it anymore. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. "You lost?" he said. It was not a kind voice. It was not a mean voice either. It was a voice that had not spoken to another person in a while and was not entirely sure how to calibrate itself. "No," Clara said, which was almost entirely a lie. "I'm looking for a man called Gideon Blackthorne." The silence between them stretched. "You found him," the man said. "Wrong time of year for it." He did not offer his hand. He picked up her rifle from the snow where it had landed, checked it over with the efficiency of a man who knew rifles, and then tucked it under his arm alongside his own. "Get up," he said. "Storm's going to get worse." Clara got up, not because she trusted him, but because the alternative was staying in the snow, and she had not ridden 3 days into the Bitterroot Mountains in November to freeze to death 10 feet away from what she came for. She stood and steadied herself against the wind and looked at Gideon Blackthorne in the insufficient light, trying to get a read on him. He was already walking. She followed. He had a cabin. She had half expected something rougher, a dugout, a lean-to, but it was an actual cabin, solidly built, with a stone chimney and thick log walls and shutters on the windows, the kind of structure that had taken serious work to make and had been made by someone who intended to stay. Inside it was warm, not just barely warm, but actually warm, with a fire burning in the hearth and a covered pot hanging over it that smelled of something with meat in it. He did not seem surprised to have a half-frozen woman stumble through his door. He took her wet coat and hung it near the fire without comment, and he brought her a blanket, and he poured a cup of something from the pot by the fire. Not coffee, something herbal and slightly bitter and very hot, and set it in front of her. Then he sat down across the table from her and looked at her. He was not what the stories described. She had expected something more wild, unkempt, possibly unbalanced. What she found was a man of perhaps 35, heavily built through the shoulders, with dark hair that was longer than fashionable but not long by wilderness standards, and a beard that was full but not unkempt. His hands on the table were large and calloused, the hands of someone who worked with them constantly, and there was a scar along the left side of his jaw that was old enough to be white against his tanned skin. His eyes were what surprised her. They were the eyes of someone who thought carefully before speaking. Not kind eyes, exactly, but not stupid ones either. Not the eyes of a man who hurt things for pleasure. "You're one of the Whitmore girls," he said. That surprised her. "You know who I am?" "Know the homestead," he said. "Saw your father twice, years back. He came up here prospecting. We didn't talk much." He looked at her steadily. "You look like him." Clara wrapped her hands around the cup. "My father is dead." Blackthorne said nothing. He waited, and so she told him. She told him about the promissory note and the terms and the deadline. She told him about the bank and the sheriff and the Hendersons and every door that had closed. She told him about Crow's offer of the Western 40 and why she had refused it. She told him about the men coming to her door at 10 o'clock at night, and about Emma asleep in the back room with her dark hair spread across the pillow, and about writing a note on the table in the dark before dawn and riding north because she had run out of every other direction. She talked for a long time. He let her. When she finished, the fire had burned down somewhat, and the storm outside had increased to a sound like a long, continuous exhalation. Blackthorne had not moved. "You rode up here in November to ask me to help you with Silas Crow," he said. "Yes?" "Why?" "Because I was told you're the only man in this territory who stood up to him and walked away." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more guarded than a smile. "People say a lot of things." "Are they wrong?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood and went to the fire and adjusted the log with a poker, and the firelight moved across his face, and Clara watched him and waited. "Go to sleep," he said finally. "Your horse is probably 2 miles down the ridge. I'll find him in the morning." He moved toward the back of the cabin. "You can have the floor by the fire. It's warmer than it looks." "We haven't finished talking," Clara said. "Yes, we have," he said. "For tonight." She wanted to argue, but her body had other ideas. The warmth of the cabin and the food and the shock of the fall were all catching up with her at once, and the floor by the fire, when she settled down on it wrapped in the blanket he'd given her, was indeed warmer than it looked. She lay there and listened to the storm and thought about Emma alone in the cabin with enough food for a week, and thought about November 26th, and thought about the way Silas Crow had stood on her porch smiling. Then she thought, he didn't say no. He had said go to sleep, but he hadn't said no. She closed her eyes, and the fire crackled, and the storm hammered the walls of the cabin, and somewhere in the Bitterroot Mountains, with $320 of debt and 5 days left on a clock, Clara Whitmore finally slept. She woke to the sound of someone moving. The fire had been fed. The storm, from the sound of things, had broken sometime in the night, and through the gap in the shutter she could see the particular gray-blue light that comes just before true dawn in mountain country, the light that makes everything look carved. Blackthorne was at the table with a cup of coffee and a map. something hand-drawn on paper that had been folded and unfolded many times. He looked up when she sat up. "Coffee," he said, and nodded at the pot. She poured herself a cup and sat across from him and looked at the map. It showed a stretch of territory she recognized. The Whitmore homestead was marked on it, and Harlan's Crossing, and what she assumed was the Crow Creek Valley up here in the Bitterroots. But there were other markings too, lines and notations she didn't immediately understand. "What is that?" she said. "Survey," Blackthorne said. She looked at it more closely. The survey lines ran across both the Whitmore homestead's western 40 acres and across the lower portions of the valley where they were sitting now, continuing in a band through the Bitterroot foothills. "Is that a mineral survey?" He looked at her over his coffee cup. "Your father showed you his maps?" "He didn't have maps. He just believed." "He was right to believe," Blackthorne said. "There's silver under your western 40 and under the eastern edge of my valley." He paused. "Which is why Crow has been trying to run me off for 2 years, and why he loaned your father money he knew your father couldn't repay." Clara sat with that for a moment. It crystallized something that had been formless in her understanding, the shape of what Crow was actually doing. The note had not been a loan, it had been an acquisition mechanism, a legal way to take a property without buying it. "How long have you known?" she said. "Long enough," Blackthorne said. "Long enough to know that he's not going to stop. He runs this territory, Miss Whitmore. The law works for him. The courts work for him. Slowly, maybe, but they get there." He set his cup down. "Whatever you came here thinking I could do for you, you need to understand what you're actually asking. This is not a debt collection problem. It is not a legal problem. It is a Silas Crow problem, which means the only solutions available to it are the kind that don't go through courts." Clara looked at him. "Tell me what you want," she said, "for helping." Something in his face changed. It went careful, the way faces go when something important is being decided inside them. "I'll find your horse," he said, standing, "and then we'll talk." He went out. Clara sat alone in the cabin with her coffee and the map and the particular silence of high-altitude morning after a storm, and the fire, and 5 days. She was still there when he came back with the gray horse, who looked indignant about its night in the storm, and showed this through a series of small, irritated movements that Blackthorne ignored completely. He stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked at Clara. "Your sister's name is Emma," he said. "She's 12. "Yes." "And you left her alone on the homestead." "I left her enough food and firewood for a week. The Hendersons are within a day's ride." He was quiet for a moment. "Crow's deadline is November 26th. 5 days?" He came back to the table and sat down and was quiet for a long time, and Clara sat across from him and let him think, because she'd learned in the past 2 weeks that pushing did not open doors that needed to open on their own. Finally, he looked at her. "I will go down there," he said. "I will deal with Crow. I will get your sister and your homestead clear of him." He paused. "But I need something in return." "I have $11, Clara said. "I don't need money." She looked at him. "I need legal standing," he said. "A way to hold this valley that Crow can't tie up in court for the next 10 years while his paid judges eat through the appeals." He held her gaze. "If I were a married man with a wife who held a valid homestead claim adjacent to my valley, and if that wife were willing to file a joint claim on the mineral rights, it would create a legal structure that would take Crow years to unravel, time enough to expose him, time enough to get a real judge up here." Clara understood what he was saying. She sat very still. "You're asking me to marry you," she said. "I'm proposing a legal arrangement," he said, "with terms. Your homestead stays yours. Emma lives where she wants. I don't." He stopped, started again, less smoothly. "It's not that kind of proposal. It's an arrangement. Practical." Clara looked at this man she had known for approximately 12 hours, who had given her a blanket and a cup of herbal tea and told her to sleep on his floor, and she thought about Emma and about Silas Crow on the porch at 10 o'clock at night, and about November 26th. "If you fail," she said, "Emma and I lose everything." "Yes." "And if you don't fail, then Crow loses everything," he said, "and you and your sister have a home and a legal claim on a silver deposit that could set you up for the rest of your lives. You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," he said. "It's dangerous. I'd be lying if I told you otherwise." The honesty of that, After all the careful dishonesty of the past weeks caught her off guard. She thought about Emma. Emma doing the chores. Emma throwing frozen dirt into a grave. Emma asleep with her dark hair on the pillow, asking in the dark, "Is it very bad?" "Yes," Clara said. Blackthorn looked at her. "Yes," she said again. "I'll do it. Let's go get my sister." They left the cabin the following morning. There was no ceremony about it. Blackthorn packed what he needed with the efficiency of a man who had done this kind of packing many times. Bedroll, ammunition, a canvas bag of dried meat and hardtack, tools Clara could not name, but that he handled with the unconscious ease of long habit. He banked the fire and shuttered the windows and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking back at the cabin with an expression she couldn't read. Then he pulled the door shut and turned away from it, and that was that. Clara watched him strap the pack to his horse, a large, dark bay that was built like a working animal rather than a pretty one, and tried to reconcile the man in front of her with the stories she'd heard in Harlan's Crossing. The monster, the killer, the savage up in the mountains. What she saw was a man who moved carefully and wasted nothing. Not a gesture, not a word, not a step. Which could be dangerous, she supposed, if you happened to be on the wrong end of it. The temperature was brutal. Last night's storm had left everything lacquered in ice, and the sun was coming in low and hard off the white slopes, bright enough to hurt. Claire's breath came in short, white bursts as she tightened the gray horse's cinch and tried not to think too carefully about what she had agreed to. She had agreed to marry Gideon Blackthorn. She had agreed to it in his cabin at dawn after knowing him for less than a day, and she had agreed to it because Emma was alone on a homestead with 5 days left on a promissory note and a land baron who had already decided the outcome. Those were the facts. She kept returning to the facts when the full weight of what she'd done tried to sit on her chest. Blackthorn came around to her side of the horses and checked the gray's pack without asking permission, adjusting a strap she hadn't cinched tight enough. "Storm left about 14 inches up top," he said. "We'll go down the south face. Longer, but the footing's better." "How long to get down?" "Day and a half if the weather holds, day if it doesn't." Clara looked at the sky. The sky was the hard, pale blue of cold that intends to stay. "It'll hold," she said. He looked at her the way he had a habit of looking at her, direct, assessing, giving nothing back. And then he mounted his horse and headed for the tree line. She followed. They rode most of this morning without talking, which suited Clara. She needed to think, and thinking was easier without conversation competing with it. The descent off the north face was slow going even on the south route. The trail was narrow and switchbacked through dense timber, and the horses had to pick their way through sections where drifted snow had buried the trail's edge, and a wrong step would have sent them sideways down a 40-degree slope. Blackthorn rode ahead and didn't look back often, which Clara initially read as indifference and then revised. He was watching the trail, reading the mountain, doing the actual work of getting them down safely. When he did glance back, it was to check the terrain behind them, not to check on her. She found she didn't mind that either. Around midday, they stopped at a wide spot in the trail where a frozen creek ran under a shelf of ice, and the horses could rest. Clara got down and stretched her back, which had tightened up from the cold and the tension of keeping her weight balanced on treacherous ground. "You ride well," Blackthorn said, which surprised her enough that she turned to look at him. He was eating dried meat without apparent enjoyment, the way he seemed to do most things, as a necessary function rather than a pleasure. "My father taught me," she said. "He said a woman who couldn't ride wasn't ready for this country." He was right. He was right about a lot of things, Clara said, just not about money. Something shifted in Blackthorn's expression. Not quite sympathy, more like recognition. "Most men who come out here aren't wrong about everything," he said. "They're just wrong about one thing, and that one thing takes the rest of it down." "What was your one thing?" He looked at her for a moment, then he stood and brushed the snow off his coat and moved back to his horse without answering. That was fine. She hadn't really expected an answer. They rode on. The wolves came back in the early afternoon. Not the same pack, or if it was, they kept their distance this time, moving parallel through the timber about 30 yards off the trail, visible only as gray shapes between the trees. Blackthorn saw them before Clara did and didn't react much, just shifted his rifle from the scabbard to across his saddle bow and kept riding at the same pace. Should we stop? Clara said. No, stopping is worse. Keep moving. Don't look at them directly. Why not directly? Because looking at something tells it you're thinking about it, he said. Wolves know when they're being thought about. Clara kept her eyes on the trail ahead and tried not to think about wolves. The gray shapes kept pace with them for perhaps 20 minutes and then fell back, and then were gone. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Does that happen often? She said. Often enough, Blackthorn said. They're not usually interested in horses and two riders. They're curious. Winter makes things curious. Winter makes me want to be inside, Clara said. Then you're in the wrong part of the country. I was born here. He glanced at her. So was I, he said. Doesn't mean it suits everyone. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her. She noted it and let it pass. They made camp that night in a hollow, where a granite overhang cut the wind, and they could build a fire without it being visible from the slopes above. Blackthorn built the fire with 3 sticks in a configuration that produced heat without much light or smoke, and Clara watched him do it and filed it away in the part of her mind that filed useful things. They ate in near silence. The food was plain and there wasn't much of it, and Clara ate what he gave her without complaint, which seemed to register with him somehow. A small shift in the quality of his silence, less guarded than before. She was thinking about Emma, the way she had been thinking about Emma with some portion of her mind during every waking hour since she'd ridden north. By now, Emma would have found the note on the table. She would have read it and known what Clara had done, or tried to do, and there was no way to predict how a 12-year-old girl would receive the information that her only surviving family member had ridden into the mountains to find a man that most people in the territory were afraid of. She would be scared. Clara knew she would be scared, and she also knew that Emma would not show it much because Emma had inherited the Whitmore stubbornness along with the Whitmore eyes. And stubbornness in that family expressed itself as a refusal to let difficulty be visible. You're thinking about your sister, Blackthorn said. Clara looked up. Is it that obvious? Your face changes, he said. Goes tighter around the eyes. She hadn't known that. She wasn't sure how she felt about him noticing it. She'll be all right for a few more days, he said. It was not a reassurance exactly. It was more like a statement of assessed probability, which was somehow more useful than reassurance. I know, Clara said. I'm not worried about whether she's managing. I'm worried about what she's thinking. What do you think she's thinking? That I've abandoned her, or that I've done something reckless. She paused. Both of those things are accurate, depending on how this goes. Blackthorn was quiet for a moment. The fire snapped. Out in the dark, something moved in the timber, something small. Not the wolves, just the ordinary night movement of a country that never fully went still. She wrote to you, he said, in the letter you left. You told her where you were going? I told her I was going to find someone who could help. Clara hesitated. I didn't give her the name. I didn't want her to worry about the specific kind of help I was looking for. Wise, he said. Or cowardly, she said. I'm not sure which. He looked at her across the fire. It was a direct look, the kind that felt like it was measuring something. There's a difference between those two things, he said finally. Most people can't tell them apart because they feel the same, but they're not. How do you tell the difference? He picked up a stick and turned it in the fire without looking at it. Cowardice protects you, he said. What you did protected her. That's not the same thing. Clara sat with that for a moment. You've thought about this a lot, she said. The difference between the two. I've had a lot of time to think about things, he said, with a flatness in his voice that closed the subject gently but firmly, the way you close a door that you're not asking anyone to open. She didn't push. They put the fire out, and she pulled her bedroll around her and lay looking at the overhang of granite above and the stars beyond it, cold and brilliant and enormous, the way stars are at altitude. And she thought about the agreement she had made and the man sleeping on the other side of the dead fire, and the fact that when she got back down off this mountain, she was going to walk into Harlan's Crossing as Gideon Blackthorn's wife, which was not a sentence she had ever expected to form. She slept eventually. She did not sleep well. They reached the lower foothills by noon of the second day, and the quality of the land changed around them as they descended. Less granite, more soil, the trees thinning from spruce and pine to cottonwood and willow along the creek bottoms, the snow shallowing from knee-deep to ankle-deep to a thin, crusted skin over frozen ground. Harlan's Crossing was half a day to the east, but Blackthorn turned them south first, toward a place he hadn't named yet. "Where are we going?" Clara said. "There's a preacher in Millhaven," he said. "Small settlement, 8 miles. He's legitimate, licensed by the territory, no connection to Crow." A pause. "We need a marriage certificate that will hold up in a federal court, not just a witness and a handshake." The reality of it landed on her again, fresh and cold. "Today?" she said. "Today," he said. "Unless you've changed your mind." She thought about changing her mind for approximately 4 seconds. Then she thought about Emma. "No," she said. "Today is fine." The preacher in Millhaven was a small, dry-looking man named Aldrich, who operated out of a room behind the general store and seemed unsurprised by the arrival of 2 snow-covered strangers asking to be married on no notice. He had the demeanor of a man who had seen enough frontier life to accept that things rarely happened at convenient times or with appropriate preparation. He looked them both over once. "You're both entering this willingly?" he said. "Yes," Clara said. Blackthorn nodded. Aldrich got his book and his certificate and a stub of pencil, and he said the words, the short version, the one without much sentiment in it, which was fine because neither of them needed sentiment right now. When he got to the part about the ring, which they didn't have, he noted it on the certificate and continued. Blackthorn said what he was supposed to say in a level voice, watching the preacher rather than Clara. Clara said what she was supposed to say clearly and without hesitation because she had found in the last 2 weeks that hesitation was a luxury she could not afford. Aldrich stamped the certificate and signed it and handed it to Blackthorn, who folded it once and put it inside his coat. "Congratulations," Aldrich said without excessive enthusiasm. He was already moving back to whatever he'd been doing before they arrived. They walked out into the cold. Clara stood on the step of the general store in Millhaven, which was not much of a town, and looked at the empty street and the gray sky and felt the particular unreality of having just done something permanent with a man she had known for 2 days. Blackthorn stood beside her, reading the sky the way he read most things, with focused attention and no particular expression. "We should keep moving," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "We should." They got back on their horses. They were 4 miles east of Millhaven, on the road that would eventually become the main track into Harlan's Crossing, when Blackthorn pulled his horse up short. Clara almost ran into him. She pulled the gray up and looked ahead. The road was empty. "What?" she started. "We're being followed," he said quietly. "Since Millhaven. 2 riders. Staying back using the tree line." Clara did not turn around because he hadn't. "How long have you known?" "Since we left the preacher's," he said. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything." "Crow's men?" "Most likely," he said. "He'll have people watching roads. He knows you rode north. He might even know why." He looked at her sideways. "He has ears in most places." Clara thought about that. "So he already knows you're involved." "He might suspect it," Blackthorn said. "He doesn't know what it means yet." He kept his voice low and unhurried, the voice of a man running calculations. "There's a fork about a mile ahead. If they're going to do something, they'll do it there. Narrower ground, better cover." "What do we do?" He looked at her. Something in his face settled into a kind of deliberate calm that was not the same as peace. It was more like a man setting down everything that isn't essential. "Stay close. Ride fast when I tell you. Don't stop for anything. And if they're ahead of us too, then we have a different problem," he said. "But let's not borrow that one yet." He nudged his horse forward, and Clara followed. The mile to the fork passed in a silence that had weight to it. Clara kept her eyes forward and her hands steady and tried not to telegraph the tension she felt, because her horse would feel it, and a nervous horse on a bad road was an additional problem she did not need. The fork appeared around a bend in the road, marked by a stand of cottonwoods with their winter white branches. Just before they reached it, 2 riders moved out of the trees ahead. Not the 2 that had been following, different ones. They had rifles already out, held casual and low, the way men hold them when they want the guns to be visible, but don't want to look like they're starting something they might have to explain. Clara recognized one of them. He was the better dressed of the 2 men who'd been with Crow on her porch that night. "Mr. Blackthorne," he said. "Miss Whitmore." He looked at them both without particular hostility, just professional attention. "Mr. Crow would like a word." "Where?" Blackthorne said. "At his office in Harlan's Crossing. He's extended you a courtesy visit." A pause. "He's asked me to convey that this is an invitation, not a demand." "And if I decline the invitation?" The man smiled slightly. "Mr. Crow was quite certain you wouldn't." Blackthorne was still. Completely still. The way large things are still before they move. Clara watched him from the side and read nothing in his face except the same deliberate calm as before. Then he said, "Tell him we'll be there by dark." The man nodded. He did not move immediately, and the two riders behind Clara did not move either, and for a moment they all sat in the road in the pale winter light with the cottonwoods bare overhead, and the only sound was the wind. Then the man touched his hat brim, wheeled his horse, and rode back toward the fork. The two behind them peeled away into the tree line without a word. Clara exhaled. "You're going to walk into his office?" she said, keeping her voice low. "It's not his office I'm worried about," Blackthorne said. "It's what it means that he invited us." "What does it mean?" "It means he knows something that he thinks changes the situation." He started his horse forward again, "and it means he's not ready to move against us physically. Not yet, which means we have time." "Time for what?" "To figure out what he knows," he said, "and what he thinks he has." They rode east toward Harlan's Crossing, and the sky behind them went the color of old iron as the afternoon died, and Clara rode beside a man she had married 5 hours ago over a stub of pencil and a preacher's license, toward a meeting with the man who had taken everything her father had built and intended to take the rest. She kept her back straight and her hands loose on the reins. The town appeared at the edge of the plain as the light failed, its lanterns small and yellow in the early dark. Clara had ridden into Harlan's Crossing a dozen times, and it had always been just a town. Now it felt like something she was riding into the center of rather than through. "When we get there," she said. "What do I do?" Blackthorne looked at her. It was the same measuring look as the night before, direct and undecorated. "Whatever you think is right," he said. "You know the situation better than I do. You know the people." "That's not very specific guidance," Clara said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She thought about pressing him for something more concrete. Then she thought about every door that had been closed to her in the past 2 weeks, and every person who had looked at her with pity and done nothing. And she thought about what it had taken to ride into the mountains alone in November. She did not need specific guidance. She needed Emma back. They rode into Harlan's Crossing as the last of the light went out of the sky. 2 figures on tired horses, and the town watched from its windows the way small towns watch things that are about to change, with the particular stillness of people who have not yet decided which side of a line they're standing on. Clara did not look at the windows. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, and her hands steady, and rode beside Gideon Blackthorne into whatever was coming next. The sign above Crow's office caught the lantern light as they pulled up. S. Crow, Land and Mineral Interests. It had always been there. She had ridden past it 100 times. Tonight it looked different. Everything she was finding looked different once you understood what it meant. Blackthorne dismounted without hurry and tied his horse. He looked at Clara once across the horses' backs, and there was something in that look. Not reassurance, because he didn't seem built for reassurance, but something steadier than that, a kind of acknowledgement. "You're here. I'm here. Let's see what this is." Clara tied the gray and straightened her coat and stepped up onto the boardwalk. Blackthorne held the door. She went in. Silas Crow's office was warm. That was the first thing Clara noticed. The warmth of it, the deliberate, curated comfort of a man who understood that comfort was its own kind of power. There was a fire in a proper stone fireplace, not a frontier hearth, but an actual fireplace, with a carved mantel and brass fittings. The desk was dark walnut, wide as a dining table, with papers arranged on it in the organized way of someone who wanted visitors to see that he had a great deal of business to attend to. 2 oil lamps burned on iron stands, throwing warm light across a room that had a Persian rug on the floor and framed survey maps on the walls. Clara had been in this room once before, 3 years ago, when her father had come to discuss grazing rights on the eastern boundary. She remembered thinking then that the room did not belong in Harlan's Crossing. that it was a room from somewhere else, dropped into a frontier town to remind everyone who walked into it exactly where the power was concentrated. She thought the same thing now. Crow was standing behind his desk when they came in, which meant he had heard them on the boardwalk and had time to position himself. He looked at Blackthorn first, a long, direct look that had nothing friendly in it despite the pleasant arrangement of his features, and then at Clara, and then back at Blackthorn. "Mr. Blackthorn," he said, "I've wanted to meet you for some time." "I know," Blackthorn said. Crow gestured toward the chairs in front of the desk. He remained standing, which was a choice. Blackthorn remained standing too, which was also a choice. Clara stood between them and felt the particular tension of two men who have been in each other's calculations for years finally occupying the same room. She sat down. Not because she was tired, but because sitting while they stood gave her a clear view of both of them, and a clear view seemed like the most useful thing she could have right now. Crow looked at her sitting down and something flickered across his face. A brief, involuntary recalibration, like a man who prepared for one kind of game and found a different one on the table. "I understand you've been to visit the preacher in Millhaven," Crow said. "So he knew already?" Clara kept her face neutral. "We have," she said. "Congratulations are in order then." He said it with perfect pleasantness, the same pleasantness he had used on her porch that night, and it landed with the same quality. Not warmth, but the surface of warmth, polished smooth. He moved around the desk and settled into his chair, crossing one leg over the other, unhurried. "I'll be direct with you both. I know what you're attempting. A joint homestead claim with mineral rights, legally married to create standing that's harder to challenge. It's a reasonable strategy." "I'm glad you think so," Clara said. "I think it's reasonable," Crow said. "I don't think it's sufficient." He opened a drawer and took out a sheaf of papers, set them on the desk, did not push them toward anyone. "Mr. Blackthorn's Valley sits on a territorial land grant from 1871. That grant has a conditions clause, continuous improvement and habitation. I have 3 sworn affidavits from men who will testify that the valley was unoccupied for a period of 14 months between 1878 and 1879. The room was very quiet. Blackthorn said nothing. "Whether those affidavits are accurate is a matter for the courts," Crow continued, "but courts take time. And in the meantime, a disputed claim cannot support a mineral rights filing." He looked at them both with the expression of a man explaining mathematics. "What you've built today is a legal structure on a cracked foundation. I can have those affidavits filed with the territorial office by the end of the week. By the time any federal court looks at your claim, the question of Mr. Blackthorn's Valley will already be in litigation." Clara looked at him across the desk and thought, "He's right." Not about the affidavits. She had no way of knowing whether those were fabricated, though she suspected they were, but about the strategy. It was exactly the kind of maneuver that Crow would have had prepared and waiting. He had been planning this for 2 years. He had a drawer full of weapons, and he was showing her just one of them. She looked at Blackthorn. His face had not changed. He was looking at the papers on the desk with the same deliberate calm she'd been watching for 2 days, and she could not read what was happening behind it. Then he looked at Crow. "Those men," he said, "the ones who signed your affidavits? You pay them on the 1st of the month?" Something moved in Crow's expression. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you are," Blackthorn said. "I know 2 of the 3 names you'll have on those papers. They work your lumber operation. They've worked it for 6 years. He paused. "There's a man named Reeves in the territorial capital, federal land office. He's been looking for exactly the kind of documented conflict of interest that a land baron manufacturing testimony would create." He let that sit. "I wrote to Reeves 8 months ago. He wrote back. I have that letter at my cabin." It was Clara's turn to recalibrate. She looked at Blackthorn, who had said nothing about any letter from any federal official, and understood that she was watching a man who had been playing a longer game than she realized, and that the game had rules she hadn't been told yet, and that she was going to have to trust that the rules made sense even before she understood them. Crow's pleasant expression had not disappeared, but it had thinned. "That's an interesting claim," he said. "It's not a claim," Blackthorn said. "The letter exists. File your affidavits. By the time they reach the territorial office, Reeves will already have a copy of everything in that letter." He moved, not toward Crow, just a shift of weight, but Crow's eyes tracked it. What you'll have done is given a federal investigator a live example of exactly what he's been looking to document. The fire in the hearth crackled. One of the oil lamps hissed slightly as something moved in the wick. Crow uncrossed his leg. He leaned forward and put both hands flat on the desk, and for a moment the pleasantness dropped completely, and what was underneath it was something colder and more honest. "What do you want?" he said. "Emma?" Clara said immediately. She hadn't planned to speak. The word came out of her the way water comes out of something cracked. Not chosen, just released. "I want my sister. I want her tonight. And I want the note discharged." Crow looked at her. "Your sister is—" "Don't," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "Don't tell me she was sent somewhere. I know she wasn't. You took her as leverage and you kept her close. You're too careful to do anything else." The silence stretched. Then Crow looked at one of his men who was standing near the door. She hadn't noticed him until now, a broad man in a dark coat who had been as still as furniture. Crow gave him a look that communicated something, and the man went out. "She's been well treated," Crow said. The pleasantness was back, but it sat differently now, worn rather than natural. "I want you to know that." "I don't care what you want me to know," Clara said. Blackthorn put a hand on her arm. Not restraining, just present. A brief touch that said, "I'm here," and nothing more. She felt it and steadied. Crow looked at them both for a long moment. He was running calculations. She could almost see it, the way you can sometimes see weather moving across open ground before it arrives. "The note is discharged," he said finally, "and the girl will be returned to you tonight." He straightened a paper on his desk that didn't need straightening. "But this matter is not concluded. You understand that?" "I understand it," Blackthorn said. "I'd expect nothing else from you." They looked at each other across the walnut desk, these two men who had been in each other's calculations for years, and what passed between them was not a threat exactly. It was more like a mutual acknowledgement. Two forces that had finally found each other's actual position and were now measuring the ground between. Clara sat in her chair and waited. Emma came through the door 7 minutes later. Clara counted the minutes, which was something her hands and feet did while the rest of her sat still. 7 minutes. Then the door opened and the broad man came back in, and Emma was beside him, not behind him, walking under her own power with her chin up and her dark hair pinned back slightly crooked the way it always was. She was wearing her own clothes. She looked tired and scared and fiercely, visibly determined not to look scared, which was so profoundly and exactly Emma that Clara's throat closed completely. Emma saw Clara and stopped walking. "Clara," she said. Just the one word. Clara was out of the chair. She crossed the room and put her arms around her sister, and Emma pressed her face into Clara's shoulder, and they stood there in Silas Crow's warm, well-appointed office, while Crow watched from behind his desk and Blackthorn watched from the doorway. And Clara held Emma and felt the particular trembling that Emma would never have shown if she'd had any choice. The small, involuntary shaking of someone who has been holding everything together alone for too long. "I've got you," Clara said, low against Emma's hair. "I've got you. We're leaving right now." "I knew you'd come," Emma said into her shoulder. Her voice was muffled and she was trying to sound matter-of-fact about it, which she almost succeeded at. "I told them you'd come." "Were you scared?" A beat. "Yes," Emma said, with an honesty that cost her something. "Good," Clara said. "Fear means you're paying attention." She straightened and looked at Emma's face, checking, cataloging, looking for damage. What she found was tired eyes and a bruise along the left side of Emma's jaw that was yellowing, old enough to be 3 or 4 days. Clara looked at the bruise for a moment and felt something cold move through her, the specific, quiet cold of a rage that has no safe place to go right now and so goes still and waits. She looked at Crow. He met her eyes and said nothing. His face said, "That did not happen here." She held the look for one more second, then she turned Emma toward the door. Blackthorn stepped aside to let them through. They spent that night at the boarding house on the east end of Harlan's Crossing, the one run by a widow named Mrs. Taft, who asked no questions and had a stove that worked and 2 rooms available. Clara put Emma in one room and sat on the edge of the bed and let Emma talk, which Emma needed to do, haltingly at first, and then in the way of someone who has been holding a great deal of water and finally finds a drain. They had held her in a room at Crow's lumber operation north of town. 2 men had been posted outside. She had not been physically harmed beyond the one incident with the bruise, which had happened when she had tried to get out through a window on the second day, and one of the men had grabbed her by the arm, and she had elbowed him, and he had not been gentle about what happened after. She had been fed. She had been given blankets. She had been given, in the careful, deliberate way of Silas Crow, just enough to prevent outrage while remaining in no doubt whatsoever about her situation. She had been there 11 days. Clara listened to all of it with her hand on Emma's hand, and when Emma finished, she sat quietly for a moment. "You did well," Clara said. Emma looked at her. "I just waited." "Waiting is hard," Clara said. "Waiting when you don't know what's coming is the hardest thing there is." Emma was quiet. Then, "Who is that man?" "The big one. He came in with you." Clara considered how to explain Gideon Blackthorne to a 12-year-old who had spent 11 days alone in a room and had just been retrieved from a land baron's office in a scene that must have looked, from Emma's perspective, extremely strange. "He's someone who helped me find you," Clara said. Emma looked at her with the eyes that saw too much. "The note said you were going into the mountains." "I did." "To find help." "Yes." "And he was the help." "Yes." "He's very large," Emma said, which was clearly not the word she had started with. "He is," Clara agreed. A pause. "Is he coming with us? Back to the homestead?" Clara thought about the marriage certificate folded inside Blackthorne's coat, and about the legal structure they had built in a preacher's back room, and about the look on Crow's face when it thinned and the pleasantness fell away, and about what Crow had said. "This matter is not concluded." "He's coming with us," Clara said. "We need to talk about some things first, but yes." Emma considered this. Then she lay back on the pillow with the exhaustion of someone who has been running on adrenaline and has finally used the last of it. "He watched Crow the whole time we were in there," she said, "like he was watching in case something moved." "Yes," Clara said. "Crow was scared of him." "I think so." Emma's eyes were already getting heavy. "Good," she said. Clara waited until she slept, which didn't take long, and then she went to the hall and stood outside the door for a moment with her hand on the frame, doing the interior accounting that she had been postponing, checking what was intact and what was damaged and what would need time. Emma was safe. That was the accounting item that mattered. Everything else was manageable. Blackthorne was in the common room downstairs, alone at a table near the window. He had a cup of something, and he was looking out at the dark street with the focused inward attention of a man doing his own accounting. He looked up when Clara came in and waited. She sat across from him. Mrs. Taft brought her tea without being asked and disappeared back into the kitchen. "She's asleep," Clara said. He nodded. "The bruise on her jaw," Clara said. "I saw it," he said. She picked up the tea and held the cup without drinking from it, because her hands needed something to do. "I want to understand what happens now," she said, "because I believed you tonight, about the letter to Reeves. I believed you when you said it, and I still believe it was real. But I also know that Crow is going to move the moment he decides the letter changes the calculation instead of stopping it." "He's already moving," Blackthorne said. She looked at him. "I had a man at the edge of town, Trapper, owes me a favor, watching Crow's operation when we were in the office." He turned his cup in his hands, a slow rotation that was the closest thing she'd seen to a nervous gesture from him. "He came to the boarding house while you were upstairs. 3 riders left Crow's place headed north less than an hour after we walked out." "North," Clara said, "toward the valley." "Toward your homestead," Blackthorne said. "Or the valley, or both." He set the cup down. "He's not going to wait for a federal investigation that may or may not arrive. He's going to move to establish physical possession of the land." Clara sat with this for a moment. The tea was getting cold in her hands. "My homestead is empty right now," she said. "Emma was with me." "Yes," he said. "And if his men ride in tonight and occupy it, it creates a fact on the ground that takes months to unravel legally." He looked at her steadily. "We need to leave at first light." "Emma can't—" "Emma can ride," he said. "You told me as much. She'll have to." Clara thought about Emma asleep upstairs. Emma, who had been held in a room for 11 days and had just spent an hour talking through it while the last of her adrenaline burned off. Emma, who had inherited the Whitmore stubbornness. She thought about Emma saying, "I just waited." "All right," Clara said. "First light." They sat in silence for a moment, and the common room of Mrs. Taft's boarding house was very quiet around them. Just the sound of the stove and the wind outside and the distant sound of the saloon 2 streets over, someone's laughter carrying through the cold. "The letter to Reeves," Clara said. "Is it real?" Blackthorne looked at her. A long moment. "Yes," he said. "Is the rest of it real?" "What you told him about filing and documented conflict of interest." "Most of it," he said. "Which part isn't?" He looked at her with something in his face that was close to uncomfortable, which was a new expression on him and therefore notable. "Reeves is real. The letter is real. What I told Crow about the consequences of filing, that's the direction I believe a federal investigation would go, not a guarantee." She absorbed this. "You gambled in there." "I negotiated," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes," he said. "Gambling is when you don't know your odds. I know Crow. I know how he operates, what he's afraid of, where the pressure points are. What I did in there wasn't a bluff. It was an accurate description of a risk he couldn't afford to take." Clara thought about this, about the way Crow had leaned forward and put his hands flat on the desk when the pleasantness dropped. "He was afraid," she said. "Yes," Blackthorne said. "Not enough to stop, but afraid." She stood. "I'm going to get some sleep," she said. "Whatever it's worth at this point." He nodded. She was almost to the stairs when he said, "Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. She stopped and turned. He was still at the table, still turning the cup slowly in his hands. He looked like a man who had decided to say something and was not fully at peace with the decision. "You did well tonight," he said. "In there. The way you talked to him." She looked at him across the common room. "You did the heavy part," she said. "You did the part that mattered," he said. "When you talked about Emma, that wasn't strategy. That was true." She stood there for a moment in the doorway. "Get some sleep," she said. "We've got a long ride." She went upstairs. They were on the road before the sun came up. Emma rode the gray horse without complaint, though Clara could see in the set of her shoulders the particular stiffness of someone trying not to show how tired they were. Blackthorne set the pace at something sustainable rather than fast, which Clara appreciated. Fast would have been the wrong call on frozen roads in the dark, and a horse going down with Emma on it was not a problem they could absorb. The road north ran through flat land before it hit the first gentle ridges that eventually climbed toward the homestead draw. Clara knew this stretch of country the way you know a thing you've traveled since childhood. Not consciously, but in your body, in the small calibrations you make without deciding to. They were 2 miles out of Harlan's Crossing when they heard the riders behind them, not following at a distance this time, coming fast. Blackthorne heard them first and had his horse across the road and his rifle up before Clara had fully processed the sound. "Trees," he said, low. "Left side. Now." Clara pushed the gray toward the tree line, Emma following close. They were off the road and into the shadow of the cottonwoods by the time the riders came around the bend. 4 of them, riding hard, spread across the road. Clara recognized the lead rider, the same broad man from Crow's office, the one who had brought Emma in. He had a rifle across his saddle, and he wasn't trying to conceal it. They pulled up when they found Blackthorne blocking the road. The lead man looked at him and then scanned the trees, found Clara and Emma in the shadows, looked back at Blackthorne. "Stand aside, Blackthorne," he said. "This is property business. You got no cause to be in it." "The property belongs to my wife," Blackthorne said. "That gives me cause." A beat. "Crow says otherwise." "Crow's opinion of property law doesn't hold much weight with me," Blackthorne said. "I'd suggest you turn around." The lead man looked at the rifle Blackthorne was holding, which was pointed not quite at him but not away from him either. He looked at the 3 men with him. He made the kind of calculation that men make when they've been given orders by someone who is not present and find themselves in a situation that those orders did not fully account for. "We'll report back," he said. "I'd expect that," Blackthorne said. The 4 riders held for another moment. Then the lead man turned his horse, and the others followed, and they rode back toward town. Emma watched them go from the tree line. She was very still on the gray horse, and Clara could see her jaw set in the Whitmore way. "They'll come back," Emma said. It was not a question. "Yes," Clara said, "with more men." Most likely, Clara said. She looked at Blackthorn, who was watching the road with his rifle still across his saddle. "We need to get to the homestead," he said, "and we need to get there before they do." He turned his horse north and pushed it to a canter. Clara looked at Emma. Emma looked at her. Something moved between them that needed no words. The particular communication of two people who have been surviving together long enough to understand each other at a frequency below language. Emma pressed her heels into the gray's sides. They rode hard into the thin gray light of a Montana morning, and the frozen ground rang under the horses' hooves, and behind them somewhere Silas Crow was in his warm office with his walnut desk and his Persian rug, and ahead of them was the land that had been in their family for 15 years. And between those two things was everything that was about to happen. The homestead appeared on the horizon as the sun finally cracked the eastern ridge, sending long red light across the snow. It looked small from a distance, as it always did, small and weathered and entirely inadequate looking for the weight of everything that was being settled around it. They rode through the gate, and Blackthorn pulled up in the yard and scanned the tree line in all directions with the habitual attention of a man who does not take stillness for granted. "Clear," he said. Clara dismounted and looked at the cabin she had left 11 days ago in the dark before dawn. The note on the table. The gray horse loaded for the mountains. She had come back with a husband she had known for 4 days and a sister she had gone to retrieve in a fight she had not yet finished. The cabin looked back at her without comment. "What do we do now?" Emma said from her horse. Clara looked at Blackthorn. He looked at her. "We prepare," he said. Emma climbed down from the gray and took both horses toward the small barn. Clara stood in the yard in the red morning light and looked at the tree line to the south, where the road from Harlan's Crossing came in, and thought about 4 riders turning around and riding back to report. She thought about what they would report. She thought about Crow's hands flat on the walnut desk when the pleasantness dropped. The cold was sharp and clean and honest, the way cold is in the mountains, and Clara stood in it and breathed it and tried to see the shape of what was coming clearly, without the distortion of fear. She was still standing there when Blackthorn came up beside her. "He'll come himself next time," she said. "Yes," Blackthorn said. "How long do we have?" He looked at the sky, the road, the land. He looked at it the way he looked at everything, with his whole attention, reading it like a document. "A day," he said. "Maybe less." Clara nodded. "Then let's get to work," she said, and went inside. They worked through the rest of the morning and into the afternoon without stopping. Blackthorn moved through the homestead with the systematic attention of a man assessing a defensive position, which was exactly what he was doing. He walked the perimeter of the property twice, checking sight lines from the tree line to the cabin, measuring distances that Clara could not yet understand the purpose of, noting the small dry creek bed that ran along the eastern fence line and the shallow depression behind the barn where the ground dipped enough to provide cover if you were lying flat. Clara followed him on the first circuit and watched what he was watching, trying to build the same map in her own head. On the second circuit, she let him go alone and went inside to take stock of what they had. The root cellar was better than she'd expected. She had stocked it in October before everything fell apart, and the staples were intact. Flour, salt, dried beans, a crock of pickled vegetables, the last of the season's potatoes going soft at the edges but still usable. 2 pounds of coffee. Enough to feed 3 people for several weeks if they were careful. The ammunition was the problem. Her father's sharps had about 40 rounds. Blackthorn's rifle, a Winchester repeater that was newer and better than anything the homestead had ever housed, had 3 boxes, perhaps 90 rounds. Between them, that was enough for a fight, but not for a prolonged one. And if Crow came with the kind of numbers that his operation could produce, prolonged was the scenario they needed to plan for. She was counting rounds on the kitchen table when Emma came in from the barn. "Horses are fed," Emma said. She looked at the table. "How bad is it?" "Manageable," Clara said, which was the Whitmore word for not good but not catastrophic. Emma sat down across from her. She had a bruise yellowing along her jaw and shadows under her eyes that sleep had not fully addressed, but her posture was the straight-backed Whitmore posture that their father had drilled into both of them before either could read. She looked at the ammunition and the rifle, and then looked at Clara. "Are you going to tell me the whole of it?" she said. "Not the version where you leave parts out." Clara looked at her sister. 12 years old, with a bruise on her jaw from trying to escape through a window. There was a version of this where you protected someone by keeping them at arm angles from the truth, and there was a version where you treated them as someone who deserved to know the ground they were standing on. Emma had earned the second version, so Clara told her. The silver deposit, the survey that ran under both the Homestead's Western 40 and Blackthorn's Valley. The full weight of what Crow had been building, not a debt collection, not a property dispute, but a deliberate multi-year strategy to acquire control of one of the most significant mineral deposits in the territory. She told her about the letter to Reeves and what Blackthorn had said to Crow, and the 4 riders they had turned back on the road that morning. Emma listened to all of it without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Clara finished, Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So he's coming here?" "Yes. And we're going to fight him here." "We're going to make it so that fighting us here costs him more than it's worth," Clara said. "That's what Gideon is working out." Emma looked at the window, then back at her sister. "You called him Gideon?" Clara paused. "Yes. Not Mr. Blackthorn." "No." Emma looked at her with those eyes. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, "The preacher in Millhaven, is that what you said you were going to do in the mountains?" "I said I was going to find someone who could help." "That's what I thought," Emma said, with the tone of someone who has been carefully not thinking a thing and is now allowing herself to think it. She looked at the table. "Is he good?" Clara thought about the question, what Emma meant by it, what the right answer was. "I think so," she said, which was more honest than yes and more useful than a full accounting. Emma nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, as if she had made a private decision. Then she stood up and picked up her coat. "What do you need me to do?" Clara looked at her sister and felt something that she did not have a clean word for, a mixture of pride and grief and love that had no simple name in the English language, or possibly any language. "Help Gideon," she said. "Whatever he asks." Emma went back outside. Blackthorn came in at midday long enough to eat without sitting down, standing at the kitchen counter and consuming cornbread and coffee with the joyless efficiency of a man fueling a machine. Clara watched him eat and asked her question while he couldn't walk away from it. "You were in the war," she said. He looked at her over the cup. "What makes you say that?" "The way you walk the ground," she said. "The way you look at sight lines. The way you think about things in terms of positions and distance and cover." He set the cup down. He did not answer immediately, which she had learned was not evasion, but simply the way he processed things. Fully, before committing to words. "Yes," he said. "Which side?" "A beat." "Does it matter?" "Not to me," she said. "I'm trying to understand who you are, not judge it." He looked at her for a moment, and whatever was behind his eyes, whatever accounting he was running, resolved into something that was almost candid. "Union," he said. 2 years. Came out west after." He picked up the cup again. "The mountain was easier than people." She nodded. She didn't push further because that sentence had the quality of something that had taken a great deal of internal erosion to reach the surface, and pressing it would only send it back down. "How many men do you think he'll bring?" she said. 8 to 12, Blackthorn said. "Not his regular lumber hands. He has men he keeps for situations. Harder men." He looked at the window. "He'll try to make it fast. He doesn't want a prolonged thing. That creates witnesses, stories that travel. He'll want to come in force and end it clean. And we're 3 people with 130 rounds. And we know the ground," he said. And he doesn't. He put the cup in the basin and went back outside. The preparation took the whole of the afternoon and into the early dark. Blackthorn had Emma moving things she would not have thought to move. The heavy wagon, repositioned across the south end of the yard to break line of sight from the road. Fence rails pulled from the east side and restacked against the barn wall at an angle that created a secondary position. A length of rope strung between 2 trees at a specific height that made no sense to Clara until he explained it briefly and with no flourish. A man running in the dark at that height would hit it at the chest. He had Clara working on the cabin itself, reinforcing the shutters with the interior bar brackets her father had installed years ago and never used, checking the roof for any position that might allow approach from above, clearing the area around the front door of anything that could slow an exit. At one point she was on the roof, a flat section over the east lean-to, checking a loose shingle and she looked out at the land around the homestead in the failing afternoon light. The frozen fields, the dark line of the tree line to the south, the road running into the gray horizon toward Harlan's Crossing, 12 miles, and somewhere along it Silas Crow. She thought about her father, about the 15 years he had worked this land, the particular stubbornness of a man who kept going when the ground told him no. He had believed in the Western 40. He had believed in it through bad harvests and lean winters, and a wife's death, and a note he could not repay, and he had been right, and the rightness of it had killed him as surely as the sickness. She did not know what she felt about that. She was not sure there was a feeling adequate to it. She came off the roof and went back to work. They ate together that night at the kitchen table, the three of them, the first meal they had eaten together in the homestead that had always been just Whitmore land and was now something more complicated. The food was plain, beans and salt pork and the last of the cornbread. And nobody said much until Emma said, around a mouthful of cornbread, "What happens if we win?" Both Clara and Blackthorn looked at her. "What do you mean?" Clara said. "I mean after," Emma said. She was not looking at either of them, focused on her plate with the intensity of someone who has thought a thing through and wants to get the words right. If Crow is stopped, what happens to the claim, the silver?" Clara looked at Blackthorn. "If the joint claim holds," he said, "and if Reeves follows through with the investigation, Crow's manufactured affidavits get exposed and his legal challenges collapse. The claim goes to federal registry." He ate for a moment. "Silver mining requires capital, investors. It's not something you do alone." "But it would be ours," Emma said. "The claim." "Yes," he said. Emma absorbed this. "I'd like to go to school," she said, which seemed to come from a completely different direction until Clara understood that it did not. "In a city. A real school, with teachers who know things." She looked at Clara. "Papa always said maybe someday. I'd like it to be an actual someday." Clara sat with the particular sensation of hearing her 12-year-old sister articulate the future in the middle of a situation where the future was not guaranteed, and finding it both heartbreaking and clarifying. "That's a reasonable thing to want," Blackthorn said, which was not what Clara had expected him to say. Emma looked at him with a kind of cautious evaluation. "You're smart," he said. "You should be somewhere that's useful to you." Emma looked at him for another moment. Something in her posture shifted. Not quite relaxation, but the easing of a wariness she'd been carrying since she first saw him. "Thank you," she said, with a dignity that was purely Emma. They finished eating. Blackthorn took the first watch. Clara lay down on the bed in the back room and did not sleep much, hovering in the shallow, vigilant half-sleep of someone whose body has agreed to rest, but whose mind has not signed the same agreement. She was somewhere in that gray territory when the knock came. Not a hostile sound. 3 knocks. Deliberate. She was at the door with the Sharps before she was fully awake, Blackthorn already there ahead of her with his hand up. "Wait." He opened the door. It was Henderson. He stood on the porch in the dark with his hat in his hands and his broad face serious, his breath making rapid white clouds in the cold. Behind him, barely visible, was his wife in the wagon. "I know it's late," Henderson said. "We saw lights. Heard you were back." He looked at Blackthorn, registering him, registering the rifle, registering the general situation with the expression of a man who has prepared for one thing and found another. "I heard things in town today," he said, "about Crow, about what's coming." "Come in," Clara said. Henderson sat at the kitchen table and told them what he'd heard, which was more than Clara had expected. It had moved fast through the territory the way news of conflict always moves. The meeting at Crow's office, the turned-back riders, the sense in town that something was coming to a head. 2 merchants had already sent their families to stay with relatives east of the territory. The sheriff had been seen at Crow's hotel that afternoon. "How many men does Crow have ready to move?" Blackthorn said. "I heard 12, Henderson said. "Could be more." He looked at his hat in his hands. "I'm not a fighting man, Blackthorn. I want to be clear about that up front. I got a wife and 3 children, and I am not a fighting man." "All right," Blackthorn said. "But I got a rifle, and I know this land as well as anyone, and if Crow takes this homestead, it won't be 6 months before he's looking at mine." He looked up. "So I'll stand with you if you'll have me, under one condition." "What condition?" Clara said. "Nobody asked me to do anything that gets me killed," Henderson said, with the frank simplicity of a man who has thought this through. I'll hold a position and I'll fire if fired on, and I'll stay as long as I'm useful. But I got people depending on me, and I will not throw myself away. Clara looked at him. She thought about the salt pork, the genuine sorrow in his face when he told her he couldn't help. She thought about how help comes sometimes, not in the form you expected and not at the time you planned for, and it still counts. That's fair, she said. Henderson nodded. Then he looked at Blackthorn. What do you need me to do? Crow came at midday. He came the way Blackthorn had predicted, in force, without announcement, with the particular efficiency of a man who has moved against property before and knows the choreography of it. 14 riders on the South Road, spread out wide enough that they couldn't all be taken with a single position. Clara saw them from the roof of the lean-to, where she had positioned herself before dawn with the sharps and 40 rounds and a clear sight line to the road. She had never fired at a man before. She had thought about this in the night, turned it over, looked at it from different angles. She had decided that this was not the night to resolve the question philosophically, that there were things happening that were larger than the question, and she would resolve the question in the moment when the moment required it. She watched the riders come and made herself breathe evenly. Blackthorn was at the barn, positioned behind the restacked fence rails. Henderson was at the east tree line, 50 yards out, with his own rifle and his very clear condition. Emma was in the root cellar under the cabin with the door barred, which she had accepted without argument, which told Clara exactly how frightened she was. Crow was among the riders. She could see him, the dark wool coat with the fur collar, the way he sat a horse with the ease of a man who had ridden well all his life. He was not in front. He was 3 riders back, positioned in the middle of the group with the careful instinct of a man who employs violence but does not intend to absorb it. The riders pulled up at the gate. The lead man, the broad one from the office, called out toward the cabin. Blackthorn, Clara Whitmore, Mr. Crow is here to take possession of this property under the terms of the outstanding promissory. The note was discharged, Clara called from the roof. The lead man looked up, found her, adjusted his position without appearing to adjust it. Mr. Crow disputes that the note was discharged in his own office with 2 witnesses present, Clara said, one of whom is Sheriff Pryor, who I expect he'd rather not have testifying about what he witnessed in that office. A murmur moved through the riders. She saw Crow say something to the man nearest him. Then the lead man said, "Stand down, Miss Whitmore. This can be—" What it could be was lost because 3 things happened in rapid and disordered sequence. One of the riders on the far left flank spurring toward the fence line, not toward the cabin, but toward the east tree line where Henderson was positioned. Blackthorn moving from behind the barn rails the moment the rider moved, and a shot from somewhere she didn't expect, from the tree line north of the property, a direction nobody had been watching, which meant Crow had sent men around in the night, which meant he'd planned the approach more carefully than they had planned the defense. The shot hit the edge of the lean-to roof 2 feet from Clara's position. She flattened and rolled and came up behind the roof peak and found the north tree line in her sights and fired twice at movement in the trees. She did not know if she hit anything. She worked the sharps and fired again and heard shouting from the yard below. What followed was not a clean engagement. It was the particular chaos of a fight where everything happens at once and in directions you did not predict. And the sounds are wrong. Gunfire in enclosed space sounds nothing like it sounds when you imagine it, and horses are louder than you expect. And the gap between what you intended and what is actually happening is a gap you navigate by instinct rather than plan. She kept the north tree line. She fired and reloaded and fired, keeping pressure on whatever Crow had positioned there, preventing them from moving into the open. Below her she could hear Blackthorn, not his voice but his rifle, the distinctive flat crack of the Winchester working in a rhythm that was deliberate and measured in a way that nothing else in the yard was. The lead rider went down. Not from her shot, from Blackthorn's. She saw it happen from above, the horse shying and the man falling and scrambling clear and crawling toward the fence. She did not fire at a crawling man. She turned back to the tree line. 3 of Crow's riders broke for the road. She tracked them and did not fire. They were running, not advancing, and she held what Henderson had called the condition and did not throw anything away she didn't have to. The rider who had gone for the east tree line was down from his horse, the horse running loose toward the south. Henderson had held his position. Then she heard it stop. Not gradually. just the particular cessation of a fight, where someone has made a calculation and the calculation has come out. Remaining riders had pulled back to the road. She could count them from the roof, 6, 7, fewer than had arrived. Crow was still mounted. He had not moved from his position 3 riders back. He was looking at the cabin. Then he looked up, found Clara on the roof with the Sharps, and they looked at each other across the distance of the yard in the flat midday light, and what she read in his face from that distance was not what she expected. Not defeat. Not even anger. Calculation. He was still calculating, still running his numbers. She could feel it from 40 yards. She kept the rifle up. Crow said something to the man beside him. The man nodded and turned his horse. One by one, the riders at the road turned and rode south. Crow was the last to turn. He looked at her once more before he did. Clara did not lower the rifle until she could no longer hear them. Then she sat down on the roof of the lean-to, her back against the peak, the Sharps across her knees, and did a brief internal inventory of her hands, which were shaking, and her chest, which felt like she had been holding her breath for half an hour, which was not far from the truth. Below her, the yard was a mess. Churned snow and mud, a gatepost cracked where a horse had hit it, fence rails scattered where one of the riders had gone through them. Henderson was coming in from the tree line, rifle across his back, moving at a fast walk. Blackthorn was crossing the yard toward the cabin from the barn. Clara climbed off the roof. She landed in the snow and her knees bent more than she intended, and she caught herself on the cabin wall and straightened. Blackthorn was there. He looked her over the way he looked at things, directly, checking for damage. "Hit?" he said. "No," she said. He nodded. He had a tear along the left sleeve of his coat, and she could see blood at the edge of it. She looked at it pointedly. "Grazed," he said. "It's nothing. Let me see it." Let me see it, Gideon." He stopped. She pulled the sleeve back enough to see. A shallow furrow along the outer forearm, bleeding but not seriously. She pressed her folded kerchief against it and held it. He stood still and let her. Henderson arrived, breathing hard, with the broad face of a man who has exceeded his condition and is not sure how he feels about it. "Everyone standing?" he said. "Everyone," Clara said. "Good." Henderson put his hands on his knees and caught his breath. "That's good." Emma came up through the root cellar door, which she pushed open from below with both hands, and climbed into the yard and stood there looking at the churned snow and the cracked gatepost and the 3 of them standing. "Is it over?" she said. Clara looked at Blackthorn over the kerchief pressed to his arm. "No," he said. Emma nodded, as if she had expected this. "What are we missing?" Blackthorn looked at the south road, empty now. Crow gone back toward Harlan's Crossing with his reduced numbers. He looked at it for a long time. "He came with 14 men," he said, "and he stayed back the whole time. He watched." He turned from the road. "He wasn't trying to take the property today." Clara looked at him. "Then what was he doing?" "Counting," Blackthorn said. "Measuring, seeing how we respond, where we position, how we move under fire." He looked back at the road. "The next time he comes, he'll know everything he saw today." The yard was quiet. The wind moved through the bare cottonwoods along the fence line. Somewhere to the south, a crow called twice and went quiet. Henderson straightened up from his knees. He looked at his rifle, then at Blackthorn, then at the road. "So what do we do?" "We don't wait for the next time," Blackthorn said. "We take this back to him." He looked at Clara. "On ground we choose, not ground he chooses." Clara thought about this, about the long game Crow had been playing, and the longer game Blackthorn had been playing back, and the ground between those two things. "The mountains," she said. Blackthorn looked at her. "He wants the valley," she said. "Your valley. That's what this is about. The silver runs from the western 40 up through the foothills into your territory. He can't have the whole deposit without both pieces." She looked at the tree line to the north, where the bitterroot sat white and enormous on the horizon. "If we draw him north, if he follows us up into that country, he won't know it," Blackthorn said. He said it quietly, and what was in his voice was not anticipation exactly. It was something more like recognition. "I've been in that valley for 12 years. "And he hasn't," Clara said. Henderson looked between them. "You want to lead Crow into the mountains," he said. I want to end this where the advantage is ours, Blackthorn said. And the advantage is mine in the valley. Not here, not in the territory's courts, not in his office. He looked at Henderson. You don't have to come. I know I don't, Henderson said with a certain dignity. He looked at his rifle. He looked at the South Road. He looked at Clara. Nora's going to have a great deal to say to me about this, he said. Probably, Clara agreed. Henderson put his rifle over his shoulder. When do we leave? Blackthorn looked at the sky. The same sky reading he always did, the unconscious barometric reading of a man who had been living by weather for years. 2 hours, he said, before the light goes. He turned back to the cabin. There's something I need from inside first, something I should have gotten before we came down the mountain. He went in. Clara stood in the yard and looked at Emma, who looked back at her with those eyes. Are you going to tell me I have to stay somewhere? Emma said. Clara thought about the root cellar, about 11 days in a room at a lumber operation, about the bruise yellowing on Emma's jaw, and the straight-backed way she had climbed out of the ground and asked, Is it over? And accepted the answer without flinching. No, Clara said. Emma nodded once with a gravity that was too old for 12 and exactly right for who Emma actually was. Then let's get the horses ready, Emma said, and went to the barn. Clara stood alone in the yard for a moment in the thin winter light, the churned snow around her feet, the sharps still in her hand. She looked at the homestead, the cabin her father had built, the barn, the fence line, the frozen fields running west toward the 40 acres that had silver under them. She looked at all of it with the particular look of someone who is not sure when they will see something again and wants to carry it accurately. Then she followed Emma to the barn. They rode north as the light died, 5 people on 4 horses. Henderson doubling with Blackthorn on the bay for the first stretch until they could pick up the spare horse Blackthorn kept hobbled in a meadow 2 miles into the foothills. The cold was the serious kind, the kind that gets into the joints and stays, and nobody talked much on the first hour of riding because talking cost warmth, and warmth was not something to spend carelessly. Clara rode close to Emma, not hovering. Emma would have felt the hovering and resented it, and she would have been right to, but close enough that their horses' shoulders nearly touched on the narrow sections of the trail, and Emma could feel without being told that Clara was there. Blackthorn led. He rode the way he did everything, with complete attention and no wasted motion, picking the trail in the dark with a familiarity that Clara now understood came from 12 years of this country being the only country he knew. He did not use a lantern. He navigated by the snow's reflected light, and by whatever interior map he had built through years of walking this ground in every season and condition. Henderson rode at his rear. He had not complained once since agreeing to come, and he had not talked about Nora again. And Clara had the sense of a man who had made his decision and was now on the other side of it, in the territory where the decision stops being a thing you hold in your hands and starts being a thing that carries you. They collected the spare horse from the meadow, and Henderson took it gratefully, and they pressed north and up. Crow's men found their trail by morning. Blackthorn had expected this, and said so when they stopped to water the horses at a creek that ran black and quick between ice shelves. He'll have sent riders ahead last night, he said. Men who know the mountain approaches. He's not stupid. How far back? Clara said. He listened. Not performing listening, actually listening, the way you do when you've trained yourself to read silence. Hour, maybe less, he said. They're not rushing. They're tracking, which is slower. Then we have an hour, Clara said. Less than, he said. We're going up. They're below us, which means they'll be moving faster than us once the grade steepens. Henderson looked up at the mountain ahead, the white slopes climbing into gray cloud, and said nothing. He had the expression of a man revising his sense of what he had agreed to. Emma was watching Blackthorn. She had been watching him in the particular way she watched things when she was building an understanding of them. The same focused attention she had given arithmetic tables and bird identification and everything else she had ever decided to understand. There's a canyon, she said. It was not quite a question. Blackthorn looked at her. You set on ground you choose, Emma said, and you keep looking north-northeast. There's something up there. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Clara, with an expression that said something Clara chose not to examine too closely in present company. Box Canyon, he said to Emma, 2 miles up. Single entrance, granite walls on 3 sides. High ground on both flanks. He paused. My valley is on the other side of it. It's a trap, Emma said. For whoever's on the wrong side of it, Blackthorn said. Emma nodded slowly. We need to get there before they see which side we're on. Henderson looked at her. How old are you? 12, Emma said. Can we please keep moving? They reached the canyon entrance as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in 2 days, throwing hard white light off the snow slopes and making everything look briefly, deceptively peaceful. The canyon itself was exactly what Blackthorn had described, narrow entrance between two granite shoulders, widening inside to a space perhaps 200 yards across, with walls that rose 60 feet on 3 sides and a far end that opened onto the shelf above the valley. It was also, Clara saw immediately, a place where an avalanche shelf sat above the western wall. She had seen avalanche paths before. The particular stripe of devastation where a slope had let go, trees snapped off at the same height, debris fields spreading below like a frozen wave. The shelf above the western canyon wall was intact, had been intact long enough that new snow had loaded it, but the angle was wrong for long-term stability. She had grown up in this country. She knew what wrong-angle snow looked like. She looked at it, and then she looked at Blackthorn and found him already looking at her. You see it, he said. I see it, she said. It won't take much, he said. The snow's been loading for 2 weeks. The temperature changed 3 days ago. Warm afternoon, hard freeze at night. There'll be a weak layer in there. 1 shot into the right place, she said. Maybe 1, maybe 2. He looked at the shelf. It's not guaranteed, Clara. It runs the canyon, it could run all the way to the valley entrance. And we'd be in the valley. If we're through the canyon before it goes, he said. Yes. She looked at the shelf again. At the angle of it. At the quantity of snow loaded on a face that was too steep to hold it indefinitely. She thought about her father, who had believed in the Western 40 through 15 years of evidence against it, who had been right in the end. She thought about what it meant to trust your own reading of a thing. Get everyone through, she said. Then we'll see. They moved through the canyon at a hard trot, the horses unhappy about the enclosed space and the walls and the particular echo that granite makes of hoofbeats, doubling the sound back at them in ways that confused the animal's sense of direction. Emma kept the spare horse moving with her knees and her voice, murmuring to it in the low, continuous tone that worked on frightened horses, and Clara watched her do it and thought, she's going to be fine, whatever comes. They came out the far end and onto the shelf above the valley and pulled up. Below them, Blackthorn's valley spread in the winter light, a long, sheltered basin maybe half a mile wide, the creek running through it half frozen, the cabin visible at the far end, smoke still faintly showing from the banked fire they had left 5 days ago. The mountains rose on 3 sides, and the 4th side fell away south toward the foothills. It was not a beautiful valley in any postcard sense. It was a hard valley, granite-edged, with timber that grew because nothing else could, and a creek that was useful rather than scenic. But it was protected. You could feel that, the sense of a place that the larger world had difficulty reaching. Henderson stood in his stirrups and looked down at it. That's something, he said, which from Henderson was an expression of considerable feeling. Eyes on the canyon entrance, Blackthorn said. They turned. Crow's riders appeared at the canyon mouth 11 minutes later. Clara counted them. 11 men. Crow in the middle of the group, the dark wool coat unmistakable at any distance. They came into the canyon at a walk, spreading out as they came, the kind of spread that men do when they are moving into an enclosed space and know it is enclosed. The lead riders were halfway through when Crow pulled up his horse and looked at the walls and then at the shelf above the western wall. He saw it. Clara saw him see it. Even at 200 yards, she could read the changed quality of his attention, the way his head turned toward the shelf and held. He was smart. She had never made the mistake of thinking otherwise. He said something to the man beside him and began pulling his horse back toward the entrance. Now, Clara said. Blackthorn was already bringing the rifle up. He fired once into the base of the shelf, where the snow met the granite face. The sound went up and hit the walls and came back multiplied, and for a moment there was only echo. Nothing happened. Clara had her hand on Blackthorn's arm before she knew she'd moved. Again, she said, left of the first shot. There's a seam. He looked at her. A quarter second. Then he fired. The shelf moved. It did not go all at once. It went the way large things go, with a sound that started below the frequency of hearing and then climbed through it, a deep structural groan that she felt in her sternum before she heard it with her ears. Then the face of the shelf cracked horizontally, a clean fracture line running left to right across its full width, and everything below that line began to move. What followed was not something she could fully describe afterward, because her brain had trouble holding all of it. A sound like the mountain deciding something. The sight of the slope coming down, not in a single mass, but in a boiling, churning descent that took the shape of the canyon walls and followed them, channeling down through the narrow space with a force that was simply beyond the scale that human beings are built to intuitively understand. She heard shouting from the canyon. She could not see into it anymore. The snow cloud rose 60 feet and filled the canyon mouth like a lid closing. Then there was a silence that was somehow louder than the avalanche. The snow cloud expanded and began to settle. Crow's riders, who had still been outside the canyon, 3 of them, who had pulled back when he did, sat their horses at the entrance with the particular stillness of men who have just watched something happen that their minds are still a full second behind. The canyon was full, not metaphorically. The box canyon, which had been a passage 20 feet wide and 60 feet deep, was now a flat white surface from wall to wall, the snow packed and compacted by its own weight into a density that nothing was coming out of. Clara sat on her horse on the shelf above the valley and looked at what had happened and could not immediately locate an appropriate feeling for it. What she found instead was a kind of flatness, not numbness, but the temporary suspension of response that happens when something too large for immediate processing occurs and the mind asks for time. Beside her, Blackthorn lowered the rifle. The 3 remaining riders at the canyon mouth looked up at the shelf, found the 4 of them there, and looked for a long moment. Then they turned their horses and rode south, and the sound of them faded, and the mountain was quiet in the way that mountains are quiet after violence, completely, without apology. Henderson let out a long breath that he had apparently been holding for some time. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Emma was looking at the filled canyon with wide eyes and a face from which every pretense of composure had temporarily departed. She was 12 years old, and she had just watched a mountain come down on top of a man who had held her in a room for 11 days and put a bruise on her jaw. And whatever she felt about that was hers to feel, and Clara did not try to name it for her. After a moment, Emma turned away from the canyon and looked at the valley below. "Is that your cabin?" she said to Blackthorn. "Yes," he said. "Can we go down?" she said. "I'm very cold." There was a federal investigator in Harlan's Crossing by the 3rd week of December. His name was Reeves, and he arrived with 2 territorial marshals and a document case, and the particular manner of a man who has been waiting for a specific situation to become actionable and has now been told it has. He was not impressive to look at. Middle-aged, thinning hair, a coat that had been better, but he worked with a methodical, unhurried thoroughness that Clara found, after everything, deeply reassuring. Crow's 3 surviving riders talked. It did not take long. Men who have watched an avalanche swallow 12 of their colleagues are rarely inclined to protect the employer who put them in that canyon. The affidavits, the manufactured ones, the ones Crow had kept in his desk drawer for 2 years, turned out to be signed by men who were, in fact, currently on Crow's payroll. Reeves found this straightforward to document. He also found, in Crow's office, and in a secondary set of books at the lumber operation that a cooperative accountant produced without much persuasion, a financial record of the territory's bought and paid for sheriff, 3 county officials, and a territorial judge who had been ruling consistently in Crow's favor for 6 years. Sheriff Pryor left Harlan's Crossing on a Wednesday morning and did not return. The note, Robert Whitmore's note, the $320 note that had started all of it, was voided by Reeves on the grounds that it had been issued as part of a systematic land acquisition scheme that met the federal definition of fraud. The voiding was formal and documented and signed in triplicate, and Clara took her copy and folded it once and put it in the cigar box under the floorboard, next to the daguerreotype of her mother at 20. The mineral claim went to federal registry in January under the names of Clara Blackthorn, née Whitmore, and Gideon Blackthorn, joint holders. Winter settled into the valley the way it always did, completely, without negotiation. The snow came and kept coming, and the creek froze to the bottom in the coldest weeks, and the cabin held its heat, and the three of them found the particular rhythms of people learning to share a space. It was not smooth. Clara had not expected it to be smooth. Blackthorn was a man who had lived alone for a long time, and solitude leaves marks on a person. Not bad marks necessarily, but marks. He did not always think to say things out loud that he had reached a conclusion about internally, which required Clara to ask, which he received without resentment, but also without natural ease. He was better with Emma than with Clara in those early weeks, which Clara found she did not mind. Emma's directness matched his own in a way that cut through the social friction he had with adults, and they had developed a communication that consisted mostly of Emma asking questions and Blackthorn answering them with more completeness than he offered most people. Clara watched this and thought that Emma was good for him, that having someone who demanded full answers was good for a man who had let himself become accustomed to silence. She was in the cabin one evening in February, mending a shirt by firelight, when Blackthorn came in from checking the horses and stood at the basin washing his hands and said, without turning around, "I wrote to Reeves again, about the Eastern Survey Line. If we file the secondary claim before spring, the valley boundary gets extended to include the creek junction." "All right," Claire said. "It's more land than we need," he said, "but it closes the legal gap on the north approach. Crow is gone, but someone else could—" "Gideon," she said. He stopped. "I know why it's a good idea," she said. "You don't have to justify it." He turned from the basin and looked at her. He had the same measuring look he'd had since the day she'd found him in a blizzard with wolves in the trail behind her. But something in it had shifted over the winter months. It had less caution in it. Not none. He was not a man who would ever be without caution, but less of the particular wariness of someone who does not trust their own position to last. "You don't always agree with me," he said. It was not a complaint. It was more like a statement of something he had noticed and was still orienting to. "I agree with you when you're right," Clara said. "The Eastern Survey Line is right. Me not making you explain it is also right." He stood there for a moment. Then he went and sat down across from her by the fire, which he did not always do, and the fire was between them. And outside the snow was doing what snow does in the Bitterroots in February, which is everything it wants. "The investors Reeves mentioned," he said. "The ones who'd put up capital for the mine operation." "Yes, I don't want a lot of people in this valley," he said. It came out flat, which was how he said things he felt strongly about. The feeling went inward rather than outward. "I don't want it turned into something else." "It won't be a cattle drive," Clara said. "It'll be a mining operation. It'll change things." "I know. Is that all right?" He looked at the fire. He was a man who had built an entire life around the specific proposition that he could control the perimeter of his world, that if you went far enough into the mountains and stayed there, the things you were keeping out would not follow you. And then Clara Whitmore had ridden up his mountain in November with a dead father and a sister in someone else's hands and a promissory note, and the perimeter had not held, because perimeters never do forever, and what he had found on the other side of it was a situation he could not stay out of. She thought about this sometimes, what it had cost him to come back down. Not the fight, not the physical danger, but the other cost. The choosing to be in the world again after building something so careful and so deliberate in its distance from it. "Yes," he said finally. "It's all right." She went back to the mending. He stayed by the fire. After a while he said, "Your sister wants to go to school." "She does. We should be able to manage that by fall," he said, "if the claim process is the way Reeves expects." Clara looked up at him. He was looking at the fire, not at her, which meant he had said the thing as straightforwardly as he could manage, and was now waiting to see how it landed without the additional information of watching her face. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. Once. Emma left for school in September. Not far. A proper school in the territorial capital. A 3-day ride with a family that Reeves had vouched for and that Clara had visited twice and approved of with the particular thoroughness of a person who has learned that approving of things carelessly leads to consequences. The school had 7 teachers. It had a library with 400 books. It had other girls Emma's age who would be strangers for about 48 hours, and then, knowing Emma, would not be strangers anymore. The morning they put her on the stage in Harlan's Crossing was cold and clear, the first cold of the new autumn, and Emma had her bag and her coat and her best pin and the expression of someone trying very hard to look as if they were not actively thrilled, because thrilled might seem disloyal. She hugged Clara for a long time. Clara held on. "Right," Clara said. "Every week," Emma said. "Every week means every week." "I know what every week means," Emma said, with a 12-year-old's precise offense at the clarification. Then she stepped back and looked at Blackthorn, who was standing a few feet back with his hat in his hands, which was as close as he came to ceremonial. Emma looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped forward and hugged him, which surprised him visibly. He went briefly, comically still, the way a man goes still when something catches him without warning. And then his hand came up and he patted her shoulder once, twice, with the careful and somewhat mechanical tenderness of someone who is new at this particular thing. "Don't get in trouble," he said. "I won't," Emma said. "Don't lie to me either," he said. Emma laughed. It was Emma's real laugh, the one that came out when she was not monitoring herself, and the sound of it on that cold September morning on the main street of Harlan's Crossing was something Clara kept. The stage pulled out and Emma was in it, and then she was gone around the first bend, and the sound of the wheels faded, and it was just the two of them in the street. Blackthorn put his hat back on. He looked at the empty road for a moment. "She'll be fine," he said. "She'll be better than fine," Clara said. He looked at her. Something in his face had the quality of a man who has arrived somewhere by a route he would never have planned and is now looking around at where he is, honestly, without the protection of the distance he used to maintain from everything. "You going to be all right?" he said. "Without her here?" Clara thought about this question and gave it the honest answer. "For a while it'll be hard," she said. "Then it'll be all right." He nodded. He understood the structure of that. The hard part first, the all right part after. The way those two things were not opposites, but a sequence. They walked back to where the horses were tied. Clara untied the gray and stood holding the reins for a moment, not quite ready to mount, looking at the town that had closed every door on her 14 months ago and had since watched those doors open in ways that Harlan's Crossing was still adjusting to. The S. Crow. Land and mineral interest sign was gone. Someone had taken down the hardware and left the ghost of the letters on the siding, pale rectangles where the paint had not faded. A new sign was going up next door. A small land office, territorial, neutral. Nobody's property. She thought about her father. She thought about him often, not always with sadness, sometimes with something more complicated, the particular relationship the living have with the dead, when the thing the dead person believed in turns out to be true. Robert Whitmore had believed in the Western 40 for 15 years, and he had been right, and he had not lived to know it. And that was the specific grief that did not go away, but became, over time, something she carried differently. She thought about what it cost to be right about something, how being right was not the same as being safe, how the two things had nothing to do with each other. She thought about a woman who had ridden into the mountains in November with $11 and a dead father's rifle and the name of a man most people were afraid of because every other option had closed. People make choices like that, and they tell themselves later that they had no choice, that the circumstances forced them, that there was no other road. Clara had told herself this too in the early weeks, but she had stopped believing it. She had had choices. She could have signed the Western 40 over to Crow. She could have taken Emma and gone east to relatives she barely knew. She could have found a smaller life and stayed inside it. She had chosen not to. That was not nothing. In fact, that was everything. Blackthorn was already mounted, waiting without impatience in the way he waited for things, watching the street with his habitual attention. He looked at her. "Ready?" he said. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up into the saddle, and the gray shifted under her and steadied, and she settled her weight and gathered the reins. The road north ran out of Harlan's Crossing and through the foothills and up into the Bitterroot Mountains, to a valley where a cabin held a fire, and a creek ran half-frozen through granite country, and the largest silver deposit in the territory sat under the ground and waited, the way valuable things wait, for the people patient and stubborn and honest enough to deserve them. "Ready," Clara said. They rode.